I was startled from these musings by the sight of a great rising of foam and water on our port hand, which had the appearance of a submerging submarine. I called to the sonarmen for a target report. The sonar officer replied, "Sir, our acoustic sonar can't receive effectively while we are steaming like this at 20 knots. I looked back at the queer foam, already far behind, but kept my ship on course. I debated turning back until it was too late to do so. Why couldn't I act promptly and decisively? I cursed my indecision and the possibly lost opportunity. Warrant Officer Iwata stepped forward, stood miserably at attention, and said, "Commander, it was my fault, sir. I should have spotted the sub before it submerged. Please blame me." Iwata was an expert lookout. His eyes were unbelievably keen. Where other spotters might observe the tiny image of a surfacing submarine at 10,000 meters, Iwata could spot them at distances up to 20,000 meters. But Iwata and the rest of us had been caught off guard. We rejoined the Tanaka flotilla soon afterward and fueled cruiser Jintsu and the 3 destroyers, which were almost bone dry. By 2030, on March 1st, the fueling was completed. Jintsu and the 4 destroyers then formed up 2,500 meters between each ship in a hunt for enemy submarines. It was a cloudy night with limited visibility, but the sea was calm, and we hoped to discover surfaced targets. Staring, straining, my crewmen clung to their posts, still bitter and angry from our midday failure. A sub-hunt by our ships, having no radar, was a game calling for great patience. Detection depended on the eyes of the spotters and our none too effective sonar equipment. Our 5 ships zigzagged at 18 knots for 6 hours, but made no sightings. The patience of the crew was wearing thin, and the spotters were exhausted. In the early morning of March 6, lookout Megita shouted, "A black object, 40 degrees to port. It appears to be a submarine." Every man on the bridge came suddenly alert. I raised my binoculars but could discern nothing in the darkness. Megita said abjectly, "It now looks like floating debris." This brought a general sigh of disappointment. Through binoculars I could see what looked like a broken native boat. With this letdown, fatigue returned, and for the next hour we had to fight against drowsiness. At 3:40, starboard lookout Bonichi Ikeda cried out, "An unidentified object bearing 30 degrees. It may be a submarine." All eyes strained in that direction. Something was there. Then Ikeda shouted again, "Positive submarine." Keen-eyed Iwata, the forward lookout, dejected at being scooped, turned and said, "Definitely a submarine." "Damn!" I walked to the tripod on which Ikeda's big 20-centimetre binoculars were mounted to get a close look. It was unmistakably a submarine, apparently in trouble, some 6,000 meters away. I shouted orders. "Make number 2 battle speed, 26 knots. Right, 50 degrees. Everybody to battle stations. Gunners ready for action. Ready searchlights. Ready depth charges." The crew, freed from the wearying search game, responded gleefully to the orders. The deck, long still and quiet, was now a beehive of activity. The ship quickly picked up speed. An orderly ran from astern with the message that destroyer Hatsukaze was following us. "All right. Tell the signalman to light up the blue tail lamp, showing 26 knot speed," I replied. "Hatsukaze may want to cooperate." Iwata shouted, "Surfacing submarine now distant 3,500 meters. Lieutenant Aquino hollered from his fire control post. "Commander, guns ready to open fire, sir." "We'll fire when target is at 2,500 meters, 60 degrees to starboard." The enemy submarine appeared to be adrift. Our 6 12.77 centimeters guns and the 90 centimeters searchlight were rotated to the 60-degree angle. "Aquino, observe strict blackout in turrets," I shouted. We raced headlong for the target. At 2,700 meters, a Matsukaze came around to port, bringing all guns to bear directly on the submarine. "Shine searchlight! Open fire!" I yelled. The submarine showed up clearly, and the first salvo followed. I saw 7 crewmen running around helplessly on the deck. A moment later, 2 yellow explosions burst among them, followed 5 seconds later by the second salvo. One of these 6 shells hit the target. Then the third salvo, and again 1 direct hit. The submarine blazed fiercely. Hatsukaze's first salvo was over. The second salvo barely missed, and there was no third salvo. The submarine sank so fast that it had disappeared among the waves before we arrived at the spot. We dropped 6 depth charges to cinch the job. We cut down our speed to 12 knots and combed the area together with Hatsukaze. Our sonars did not pick up any targets, but the area smelled strongly of heavy oil. We abandoned the search at 0359 and left the scene. 2 hours later, we returned to the same area because I wanted Amatsukaze's crew to view the heavy oil on the surface. Only a few officers on the bridge and the gun crew had seen the burning sub. I decided it was important to show everyone the fruit of their great strain and efforts. Oil was still rising at the place where the sub had sunk. It stretched out for miles on the surface of the sea, and the scene made a great impression on my crew. My elation over our first definite kill was diminished by the fact that our victim had already been in trouble when we attacked. It was too much like cold-blooded murder to sink a ship that could offer no resistance. We continued our hunt the following night, though the weather was quite bad, with intermittent driving rain. The big binoculars were almost useless because rain drenched their lenses. Visibility was not more than a few thousand meters. At 18:05 on April 1st, I saw in the water an eerie line of foam arrowing toward our flagship, cruiser Naka. This torpedo ran no more than 700 meters at an angle of 50 degrees from Naka's starboard side. The cruiser swerved to starboard, but too late. The torpedo hit smack amidship and broke Naka's foremast. The impact and explosion left a 5-meter hole gaping in its hull. Miraculously, however, not a single crewman was killed. Our 4 destroyers and 2 patrol ships ran wildly about, dropping many depth charges in an effort to get the attacking sub, but the enemy fled unscathed. I still marvel at the skill and daring of this submarine. It had sneaked into the narrow area, braving 4 bristling destroyers, and fired its torpedo at extremely close range. Although Naka had taken in 800 tons of water, her watertight compartments held and prevented her sinking. She limped back to Japan under escort of several destroyers. Back in the homeland, it took weeks to effect her repairs. Such was the price of complacence. We all shared in this guilt, and I had learned another lesson. Picture taken at Sasebo in 1934, when the author was a lieutenant commander, with wife Chizu, daughter Yoko, left, and daughter Keiko, centre. Destroyer Amagiri. In 1937, author Hara commanded this ship in carrying army troops to Shanghai, where he had his baptism of fire on August 21st. Amatsukaze, launched in 1940, was the finest destroyer of her day. With 52,000 HP engines, she was capable of 35 knots and carried 6 5-inch guns and 8 torpedo tubes. Hara commanded Amatsukaze in the Philippines, the Java Sea Battle, and the disastrous Midway operation. Off Guadalcanal on November 12, 1942, Amatsukaze sank D.D. Barton and inflicted heavy damage on the cruisers San Francisco and Juno. Leading officers of the Imperial Navy's 2nd Destroyer Squadron in October 1941, shortly after the meeting at which Admiral Yamamoto revealed plans for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Shown here are Commander Hara, 2nd row, 3rd from right, and Squadron Commander Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, front row, 4th from left, who sank 1 U.S. heavy cruiser and damaged 3 others in a brilliant action off Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's fighting group rushing towards Guadalcanal, November 14, 1942. Picture taken from aboard Kondo's flagship cruiser Atago, 12,986 tons. Cruiser battleship Kirishima, 27,500 tons, in the centre, followed by the cruiser Takao, 12,986 tons. Photo courtesy Mrs. Matsuji Ijuin. Linter Jack Kennedy almost lost his life on the night of August 1, 1943, when one of Captain Hara's destroyers cut his torpedo boat in half. Shown here is PT-109, the craft the President commanded. Official US Navy photo. Rabaul was central supply base for Japanese forces in the Solomons and New Guinea. Famed Tokyo Express often sortied from Rabaul before US air attacks made the port too dangerous. Here, bombers score direct hit on Japanese corvette. Destroyers Shiga and Samidar of the 27th Flotilla advancing along the eastern coast of Bougainville, October 7, 1943. A decrepit old ship capable of only 30 knots, Shigure became under Hara's command the most famous destroyer in the Japanese Navy, completing numerous patrols and fighting 3 major battles without losing a man. Official Imperial Navy photo. Captain Hara's cruiser Yahagi sailed for Okinawa on August 6, 1945, the last sortie of the war. Without fuel for the return voyage, Yahagi was to sink as many US ships as possible in a desperate attempt to save the home islands. Miraculously escaping near misses in this dive bomber attack, Yahagi was finally sunk on the afternoon of August 7th, with a loss of 446 lives. Hara was one of the few survivors. Official US Navy photos. Battleship Yamato, 72,800-ton pride of the Imperial Navy, sailed from the inland sea on August 6, 1945, on a suicide mission to attack US ships off Okinawa. The next day she was caught at sea by 386 carrier-based planes from Task Force 58 and severely pounded. Hara, whose Yahagi was sunk that same afternoon, saw the great battleship racked by a gigantic explosion. When the smoke cleared, Yamato was gone. The mystery of US Air Force unpreparedness at Clark Field is still unresolved. As Lewis Morton wrote in The Fall of the Philippines, all forces in the Philippines had knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor hours before the first Japanese bombers appeared over Luzon. A dawn raid at Davao had given notice that the Japanese had no intention of bypassing the archipelago. The early morning bombings on Luzon gave even more pointed warning that an attack against the major airbase in the islands could be expected. Colonel Campbell testifies that Clark Field had received word of the approaching Japanese aircraft before the attack. Colonel Eubanks states that no such warning was ever received. Other officers speak of the breakdown of communications at this critical juncture. There is no way of resolving this conflicting testimony. General Arnold, 8 years after the event, wrote that he was never able to get the real story of what happened in the Philippines. About the results of the attack there is perfect agreement. Of the modern combat bombers, 18 of the original 35 B-17s were destroyed. 53 P-40s, 3 P-35s, and about 30 miscellaneous observation planes and smaller bombers were also lost. Thus, after 1 day of war, Morton writes, with its strength cut in half, the Far East Air Force had been eliminated as an effective fighting force. Japanese losses, 7 fighter planes. The hapless attackers were light bombers of the Netherlands Air Force. This was Submarine Perch, SS-176, but she was not finished off by this attack. She was attempting to mend earlier inflicted damage when these 2 Japanese destroyers attacked. Submerging to evade Hara's attack and effect repairs, Perch surfaced early in the morning of March 3rd and was finally scuttled by her crew when attacked by 2 other Japanese destroyers. This attack was made by USS Seawolf, SS-197. The Christmas Island venture marked an anticlimactic end to the first phase of Japanese operations in Southeast Asia. It was followed by a lull of more than a month in the Pacific. On April 3rd, my ship bade farewell to the limping cruiser Naka near Surabaya and joined the fleet in the Java Sea. We arrived in Batavia the next day and left that afternoon for Makassar, where we had an easy 5 days, while engines and weapons were checked. I allowed my crew to go ashore in shifts. The city was buzzing with activity, peace was restored, and business was normal. Stores were filled with goods of far greater variety than had been available in Japan 6 months before. After the war, many of my countrymen said that Japan should have concluded a peace in the spring of 1942. instead of waiting to swallow Allied peace terms after Japan had been bled white. But in the early months of 1942, there were no thoughts of suing for peace. Indeed, many politicians and military leaders firmly believed that the occupation of Southeast Asia was assured as permanent and that Japan, with the immense resources of this great region, would be invincible. From Makassar we moved to Surabaya, and at last, on April 17th, we were ordered to return to Japan. The men were jubilant. Drafted sailors dreamed of discharge and going home. They hoped for an end of war. Officers could hold no such rosy prospects, but they were as happy as the enlisted men at the chance of returning to Japan. We left Surabaya to return to Makassar, and the following day joined a group of destroyers escorting transports laden with ore, food and oil for Japan. The voyage was without event but pleasant. When we entered home, waters and the islands of Japan loomed on the horizon. Everyone jumped with joy. Amatsukaze and the other destroyers quietly entered our home port of Kure on the 2nd day of May. The hundreds of tiny islands dotting the inland sea were a peaceful and welcome sight. Seagulls swooped and cried, and small fishing boats tooted greetings to us. Japan is so different from the tropics. The southern sea is indigo, radiant flowers glare in the broiling sun, and everything is garish. Back in Japan, all colours are sedate and soothing. We had missed the cherry blossoms of early April, but young leaves sprouting on the cherry trees were as much a treat to us as the blossoms. The day after our arrival in Kure, I ordered the ship's store to be opened. Duty orders were kept to a minimum so that everyone could take it easy. Lieutenant Goro Iwabuchi, my deputy, went ashore to arrange a ship's banquet. He booked a reservation at the Morisawa restaurant for a 240-man party and reported, "The operator said he was not sure of providing food enough for us because many other ships are holding similar parties in the city and buying up all available materials, but he has a good supply of liquor." When the evening party was announced, Amatsukaze almost rocked with the joy of her crew. Lots were drawn to select the 10 unlucky men who had to stay behind and guard the ship. The rest of us went ashore at about 1700. The bustling city of Kure was filled with sailors. Streets and sidewalks were jammed. For our banquet, we brought enough canned food to supplement the restaurant's larder. There were only 5 geisha girls to serve our entire party. They were harried enough just trying to keep the more than 200 guests supplied with food and drink. To add to their chore, these few girls had also to entertain us with singing and dancing. But free-flowing drinks soon saturated the guests, and many enlisted men were soon volunteering to help the girls. My boys began to sing and dance. In the course of the evening, practically every one of my men came to offer me an individual toast. I responded to every well-wisher. I don't know how much sake I consumed in the process. Nothing but my rugged physique pulled me through the chain, drinking that lasted until the banquet ended around midnight. On the following day, 3 to 6 day leaves were authorized for all hands. The first third of the crew left for home that day, and I boarded a night train for my home. My heart brimmed with joy as the train reached Kamakura in the morning of May 4th. It was a perfect day. Balmy sea breezes rustled the graceful pine trees covering this 800-year-old city. My family was waiting to greet me on the station platform. Little Mikito, almost 3, trotted with a hand in his mother's, shouting, "Daddy, Daddy!" I hugged him. He had grown so fast during my absence. Daughters Yoko, 12, and Keiko, 9, shouted, "Welcome home!" My wife, Chizu, smiled happily. My home was only a 20-minute walk from the station, but I felt that this was a triumphant homecoming and hired a cab for the occasion. The children were wide-eyed, for they seldom rode in a taxi. Back home, we opened packages of presents I had brought from the south. The children shrieked with joy at the sight of chocolates, a rare treat in those days. In the evening, Mr. Tanzan Ishiboshi, our good neighbour of many years, came to offer his congratulations. At his invitation, my family went to his home for dinner. Ishibashi was the editor-publisher of the magazine Toyo Keizai, Oriental Economist. I knew him as a man of rare insight and wisdom, but never dreamed that he would one day be Prime Minister of Japan. We enjoyed the dinner, and afterward I sat drinking sake with him. Being an economist, he was eager to hear about the situation in Southeast Asia. "Is our Navy powerful enough to control these vast areas and secure their rich resources for Japan's industrial workshops?" he asked. With a man of his caliber, there was no point in trying to hide the truth. "We have won a series of battles simply because the enemy outblundered us," I replied. "You know as well as I do of the immense productive capacity of the Allies. There is no room for optimism for Japan in this war." He was stunned by what I had to say. Censorship was so complete that he was unaware of many of the facts of this war. In 1956, just before he became Prime Minister, my book of war experiences was published in Japan. Ishibashi wrote an introduction for the volume that made me blush. He wrote that our talk that evening in 1942 convinced him that I was more than an ordinary Navy officer. The 6-day leave passed quickly. Orders for my new assignment, calling for instant departure, might come at any time. Once orders were issued, there would be no time for an overnight trip to Kamakura. In order to be with my family as long as possible, I took them back with me to Kure on May 10th. The children got a kick out of their first journey, especially when we registered in a hotel. When things were easy, we strolled in the streets or climbed the hills surrounding the city. The Officers' Club delighted my family because it still served rich meals unavailable in town. My children talked about the club dinners for many years, particularly in the days of privation just after the Japanese surrender. Jimmy Doolittle's surprise air raid on Japan in April was quickly forgotten. The B-25 bombers did very little damage. The army announced that all of the attacking planes were shot down. Japan was so drunk with her own great victories and vast conquests that the Doolittle raid was no more than a flea bite. 4 days after my return to Kure, sweeping reassignments came for most of my crew. Practically all of my officers and half of the petty officers and men were transferred. Every day saw my experienced officers and men leaving for new ships and new officers and recruits arriving to replace them. Such changes were going on throughout the Navy. I could not imagine what the High Command was thinking. My trained crew was being broken up, and I resented it. Other skippers felt the same way. It would take at least 2 months to drill into shape this conglomeration of new men who had never worked together. And what would happen if we were called into action before they were ready? When the Midway operation plan was revealed on May 20th, I thought the High Command must have lost its mind. This surprising news was whispered to me at the Kure Naval Station by Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka. I gasped. "What? What does this mean, Admiral?" I stammered. "Are we going to conduct it with this crew?" "Shh," said Tanaka dispiritedly. "As a matter of fact, I am not sure about it. I hope it's untrue." Tanaka's flotilla of 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers sailed quietly from Kure on May 21st. We went at 20 knots toward Saipan, where specific orders awaited us. The day after leaving Kure, I heard angry shouts and the sound of someone being hit, and I went out on deck. There Lieutenant Kazue Shimizu, the new gunnery officer, was ranting at a sailor. As the hapless man stood there penitently, Shimizu hit him blow after blow with his fist. I was astonished. "What's going on?" I demanded. Shimizu turned toward me, his eyes still glowing with rage. "Commander, this man saw me but failed to salute," he spluttered. "I am disciplining him." "Is that right?" I turned to the petty officer. "That is correct, sir," he replied shamefully, his face flushed from the beating he had taken. I was shocked to discover that the man was Ikeda, the expert spotter who had been cited for his discovery of an enemy submarine near Surabaya. I dismissed him with a strong warning and asked Shimizu to come to my cabin. He looked bewildered, but followed me without saying a word. I closed the door of my cabin and offered Shimizu, standing at ramrod attention, a chair. I was distressed at the scene, but tried my best to restrain myself. Shimizu, you may smoke if you wish. This is a man-to-man talk, not between a skipper and his gunnery officer. I don't want to criticize you or defend this sloppy man. But I must make it clear that I do not subscribe to the maintenance of discipline by physical punishment. I don't know what your former skipper's policy was, but it is my belief that a destroyer crew must maintain perfect teamwork if they are to fight most efficiently. The 250 men of this ship must work as one man. They must be knit together in real harmony and friendship. Shimizu saw what I was driving at. He looked down unhappily, but not without showing his disagreement. Maintenance of good teamwork and proper order is not easy, but I have done it without resorting to corporal punishment. It is hard, but worthwhile. If it is too hard for you, report to me for decision, the next time you are faced with a disciplinary situation. Shimizu kept looking down in silence. I rang and asked my orderly to summon the 3 other department heads. All were new to my command. Lieutenant Shigeo Fujisawa, the chief engineer, Lieutenant J.G. Masatoshi Miyoshi, chief torpedo officer, and Lieutenant Kinjuro Matsumoto, chief navigator, quickly came to the cabin. They stood at attention, apparently alarmed at the sudden call. I have just seen Shimizu strike a sailor, I said. Since he did this in the open, I conclude that such things are taking place generally in this ship. I will not permit physical beatings of my crewmen. It must stop as of this moment. You have your orders. The officers withdrew, and there was a bad taste in my mouth. I was helplessly angry. With my crewmen living under such conditions, how could I possibly build the kind of teamwork needed for the important operation which confronted us? I recalled my experiences at Etajima many years before, and still could not forgive the tyrants who had beaten me so freely. To beat men like cattle merely deprives them of the initiative so necessary in a destroyer which must be manned by a closely knit team. Only thus can a crew work with the split-second efficiency demanded in destroyer operations. I decided to spend every spare moment in personal inspections of the ship. I heard angry voices, but saw no more physical discipline. Still, I brooded about going into action with this unblooded crew. The 1400-mile voyage, however, was quiet, and we reached Saipan on the morning of May 25th. 16 transports from Truk laden with 3,000 Army and 2,800 Navy troops had already arrived. Also in the harbour were more than a dozen sub-chasers, patrol ships, minesweepers and tankers. At a tactical conference of skippers and commanders the following day, the Midway operation was officially announced. Documents containing details of the operation were handed to each officer. We thus received the orders assigning us to escort the Midway invasion forces. The Midway operation plan went into effect on May 26, 1942. On the following day, the Nagumo task force sortied from the inland sea, destination Midway. The landing troops, escorted by our destroyers, left Saipan in the evening of May 28th. Anticipating that enemy submarines were watching, we took a faint course to the west, then turned south from a spot directly west of Tinian. Simultaneous with our departure, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's squadron of 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers left Guam. The mainstay of the combined fleet led by the new super battleship Yamato departed the inland sea on the 29th. The previous day, when our convoy had departed from Saipan, was auspicious as the 37th anniversary of Japan's 1905 victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait. A good omen, but instinctively I felt that something was wrong with this operation, and my heart was not buoyant. The next 6 days passed monotonously. At about 0600 on June 3rd, one enemy float plane was spotted a few miles ahead. It went away after a short time, but there was no doubt that this plane had notified Midway of our approach. We were then 600 miles southwest of Midway. In the late afternoon, several large planes appeared from the south. Tanaka's flagship Jintsu opened fire, and the enemy planes went away. They returned when the guns stopped, and Jintsu reopened its ineffective fire. The planes finally went away, but these actions were unnerving to us, as we were without air cover. The enemy planes came back at dusk, and this time swooped head-on at us, so that they were identifiable as 9 B-17 flying fortresses. All destroyers opened fire, throwing the enemy's timing off. Bombs arcing down from the four-engine bombers fell 1,000 meters away. They turned around and went away, none hit by our shells. Later that night, 4 enemy planes sneaked in and launched torpedoes, one of which pierced the bow of oiler Akebonomaru, killing 11 men and injuring 13 others. Watertight compartments held, and the tanker was able to keep pace with the slow transports. We were well aware that we were advancing against a fully prepared enemy, but I was no longer ill at ease. The attempts thus far against our convoy had been furtive and feeble. The Nagumo task force could smash the enemy with its sledgehammer blows. Dawn of June 5th brought murky weather with low, heavy clouds everywhere. There was practically no wind. As I stood on Amatsukaze's bridge, my eyelids were heavy after a sleepless night. Breakfast was delivered while I brooded at the weather, which would make it difficult to oppose planes that might suddenly emerge from the low clouds. I was alerted by a shout from the radio room voice tube. "Commander, our main task force is sending out many urgent messages." "All right, bring them to me promptly as each one comes in." Within moments, an orderly came running to the bridge and handed me a piece of paper. I scanned it, held my breath, and froze. The message was from Carrier Kaga and read, "We have been bombed and are afire." Rapidly succeeding messages reported effective attacks delivered against carriers Soryu and Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's own flagship. 3 carriers, including the flagship, set afire almost simultaneously. What was I reading? Was I dreaming? I shook my head. No, I was wide awake. I groaned and handed the messages to my officers. Lieutenant Shimizu's hands trembled as he read them. Lieutenant Matsumoto paled. Lieutenant Miyoshi was a study in incredulity. I looked around. Our convoy zigzagged on its way. Other skippers and their officers must be reading the same shocking news. Staggering as these reports were, we had to continue as scheduled, having received no orders to the contrary. The horrifying reports continued until there was no room for doubting their accuracy. The mighty Nagumo task force was being cut to ribbons. Still, we received no change of orders. What was our high command doing? My grief over our carrier losses abruptly turned into black anger. Were we to fall into the trap as the main task force had done? Damn! Damn! Operation Order, number 154, finally arrived at 0920, instructing our transports to turn northwestward temporarily, and all the fighting ships to attack the enemy north of Midway. The small escort vessels and 16 transports turned slowly from the formation and headed north. Our 6 destroyers and 1 cruiser boosted speed to 30 knots and raced toward Midway Island. Even on this windless day, my speeding destroyer kicked up ocean waves, sending showers of spray and foam to the bridge. But now I felt no exhilaration. At 10:10, Operation Order number 156 announced postponement of the Midway occupation plan and directed us to carry out offshore bombardment of Midway's ground installations. We were still 300 miles from Midway, and 10 hours seemed like a long time in approaching an alerted enemy target. We continued toward the goal without incident, except for the continually depressing reports from the front. At 14:30 on June 4th, word came from Hiryu, the last of Nagumo's operational carriers, saying, "We have been bombed and set afire." And at 16:15, Admiral Isoroka Yamamoto issued his 3rd order of the day, directing the remnants of Nagumo's force to engage the enemy in night battle. This order not only did not mention the loss of all Nagumo force carriers, but it insisted that the enemy fleet had been practically destroyed and is retiring eastward. Even with my limited view of events in this battle, I did not understand how Yamamoto could have issued that order. It now appears that he was trying to prevent the morale of his forces from collapsing, but at the time I thought he must have taken leave of his senses. At 21:30, Nagamo radioed a report which ironically bared the falsehoods of the Yamamoto order. The enemy force of 5 carriers, 6 cruisers and 15 destroyers moving westward. We are withdrawing northwestward, escorting Hiryu. It took 2 hours for Yamamoto to issue his next order, still insisting on strikes at the enemy. This reached me as I watched a ship burning fiercely some 5,000 meters to the east. We checked its position on the chart and determined that this was a Akagi. I recalled the sight of an enemy ship burning in the Java Sea. This time it was our flagship. What a difference! In the Java Sea battle, the Allies outblundered the Japanese, but at Midway only the Japanese blundered. Shortly before midnight, we received orders announcing an end to the Midway operation and instructing us to join with Yamamoto's main force. The Midway battle is termed the point at which the tide of the Pacific War turned in favor of the United States. Nagumo suffered a crushing defeat at Midway, to be sure, but that did not mean the entire collapse of the Navy. Yamamoto's combined fleet was intact, and Japan still had at least 4 carriers to match those of the US Navy. What really spelled the downfall of the Imperial Navy, in my estimation, was the series of strategic and tactical blunders by Yamamoto after Midway, the operations that started with the American landing at Guadalcanal in early August 1942. After the sour ending of the Midway operation, Yamamoto took his combined fleet to Truk and then back to the homeland. When the Americans hit Guadalcanal, the mainstay of Yamamoto's combined fleet was anchored near Kure in the Inland Sea, 2,700 miles from the battle zone. Throughout the crucial operations around Guadalcanal, Yamamoto flung into the area one small fleet unit after another. His strategy seems ridiculous when judged by hindsight. How did it develop? I rejoined the convoy of transports some 600 miles north of Midway on June 10th and helped to escort them to Truk, where we arrived on the 15th. 2 days later, we all left for Japan. We arrived in Yokosuka on June 21st and moved up to Kure 3 days later. All personnel were ordered not to talk about Midway. The real details of the battle were labelled top secret, even to commanding officers. It seemed that the order called for absolute belief in the Imperial Headquarters communiqué, discounting Japanese losses, exaggerating American ones, and insisting that the battle had ended in a Japanese victory. The combined fleet returned to the quiet of the Inland Sea, but not because it needed repairs. Serious wounds had been sustained by the Nagumo task force, but other major units were practically undamaged. Yamamoto wanted to train his men after the sweeping reshuffle of a month earlier. Yamamoto and the Navy High Command in Tokyo had not had the slightest suspicion that the Americans would launch a major offensive at Guadalcanal within 2 months after the Midway battle. They believed that it would be mid-1943 at the earliest before the Americans could mount an offensive. From June 28 through August 5, I guarded merchant ships in the Tokyo Bay area. This easy assignment gave me a welcome opportunity to train my new crew. There is no doubt that Yamamoto's withdrawal of the combined fleet to Japan waters at this time was a grave blunder. Most of the combined fleet should have been kept in Truk, yet Yamamoto's strategy was not entirely without merit. Most of his 104 destroyers got respite and the training which was greatly needed. All these destroyers would soon be engaged in a series of intense, fierce battles lasting for more than 2 years. In these battles, destroyers assumed a leading role for the first time, and probably for the last time in history. Another great blunder was the piecemeal commitment of destroyers in the Solomons, usually without the help of planes or larger warships. Yet they fought gallantly against all odds. In addition to fighting, they also transported troops. The destroyers of the celebrated Tokyo Express were the real workhorses of the South Pacific. Attrition was high. From the start of the US Guadalcanal operation on August 7, 1942, to the Japanese Dunkirk from that island on February 7, 1943, 12 of Japanese destroyers were sunk. I took part in the continuing operations in Solomon's waters from March through November 1943, in command of destroyer Shigura. Losses were higher than in the previous 6 months owing to the enemy's growing air supremacy and improved radar. My ship was the only one in the Tokyo Express to survive these battles without losing a man. Some 30 other Japanese destroyers were sunk in this period. Japanese Navy people called Shigure, Autumn Rain, the Ghost Destroyer, or the Destroyer Indestructible, and I was nicknamed the Miracle Captain. That was indeed the most glorious period of my career. An old Chinese proverb says, "A lion uses all its might in attacking a rabbit." The American Navy acted exactly like this lion when it stormed Guadalcanal and Tulagi at daybreak on August 7, 1942. Ironically, the Japanese airfield at Guadalcanal had just been completed the previous day. Guadalcanal was occupied by 2,600 Japanese construction workers and defended by only 800 Navy troops equipped with a few artillery pieces and some machine guns. The Japanese air strength consisted of only 9 float fighters and 12 unarmed flying boats. The Americans annihilated the Japanese at Tulagi in 2 hours, and 1 battalion perished on Guadalcanal as quickly. At the time, the Japanese Lion, the combined fleet, was fast asleep 2,700 miles away in Japan's inland sea. But Yamato had a watchdog at Rabaul, 560 miles northeast of Guadalcanal, in Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet. Mikawa's force, comprising 5 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 1 destroyer, steamed out of Rabaul at 15:30 on August 7th and stormed the American invaders at midnight of the 8th. Mikawa's ships sank 4 American and Australian heavy cruisers and damaged 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers in a 30-minute battle. Mikawa's only loss was cruiser Kako, sunk 2 days later by submarine S-44 as his ships were nearing Kavieng, New Ireland. Mikawa achieved one of the most brilliant surface victories of the war. He erred, however, in failing to attack any of the supply-laden transports of Guadalcanal. Mikawa has been sharply criticized for this blunder by both Americans and Japanese after the war. It is my belief, however, that Mikawa fulfilled his watchdog assignment. The real blame must rest with Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who held his combined fleet in home waters. When the American invasion was reported to Japan, the Lion pricked its ears, but did not rise. Emperor Hirohito, vacationing at his summer villa in Nikko upon hearing the news, said he would return to Tokyo immediately. But Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, went directly to Nikko for an audience. "Your Majesty, it is nothing worthy of your Majesty's attention," Nagano explained. He flashed an intelligence report from the Japanese military attaché in Moscow, claiming that the enemy had only 2,000 troops at Guadalcanal, and that their plan was simply to destroy the airfields and withdraw from the islands. It is not known how this stupid intelligence report was obtained, but even more stupid were the high-ranking officers who must have ignored the many other intelligence reports. Finally, on August 10th, 3 days after the operation started, the 5,800 Midway troops standing by at Truk were ordered to Guadalcanal by Imperial General Headquarters. The Yamato Lion had closed its eyes again after hearing of Mikawa's phenomenal win, and it slowly arose only after learning of the IGHQ order. The next day, August 11th, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's 2nd Fleet was detached from Combined Fleet for the 2,700-mile voyage to Guadalcanal. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stalled, saying that his new pilots were not yet ready, but under prodding, he did have his ships ready to sortie with Yamamoto's main force on August 16th. By that time, American forces were firmly ashore on Guadalcanal. Last-minute changes put my ship, Amatsukaze, under the command of my old friend Nagumo. Amatsukaze and 14 destroyers were assembled into Destroyer Squadron 10 around cruiser Nagara, Nagumo's flagship since the sinking of Akagi at Midway. The squadron was commanded by Rear Admiral Susumu Kimura, a destroyer expert. We went south at an easy 18-20 knots. These destroyers were all capable of 33 knots, but high speed increased fuel consumption tremendously. Our schedule was to reach Truk around August 20th, covering 2,000 miles in 5 days. Thence we would advance to Guadalcanal. Halfway to Truk, we learned of another Japanese blunder committed at Guadalcanal. On the night of August 18th, 6 Japanese destroyers had landed 800 lightly equipped troops on the eastern coast of Guadalcanal. Apparently no one in the Japanese High Command realized that the Americans had already poured some 20,000 well-equipped Marines into the island. The Japanese troops made a dogged advance through the jungle, only to be trapped 2 days later by the Americans in a mass slaughter. Fewer than 200 Japanese survived the onslaught, and they fled in utter disorder. The news shook Yamamoto. He immediately called off the scheduled stopover at Truk and ordered the fleet to rush directly to Guadalcanal. Belatedly, Yamamoto had come to his senses. Yet the army command clung to the myth that the invincible Japanese could shatter outnumbering enemy forces by their aggressive spirit. After the collapse of Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 1st Regiment, the army decided this time to throw in a brigade. This force, commanded by Major General Seiken Kawaguchi, was also defeated. But it was still a long time before the army could decide to put a full division into the effort. Yamamoto's complacency was completely shaken on August 20th. That morning, a patrol plane searching about 500 miles west of Bougainville had sighted an enemy task force, at least 1 carrier, 1 cruiser and 2 destroyers, heading north at 14 knots. Yamamoto had cancelled the stop at Truk, but practically all ships were low on fuel. We had to refuel at sea from tankers before continuing our advance. Refueling at sea is always a hazardous and nerve-wracking operation, especially so in time of war. Both tanker and warship must slow to 6 knots, and several destroyers must patrol lest enemy subs or planes attack this tempting target. On this occasion, our refueling took so long that it was 400 on the 23rd, before we arrived in position 400 miles north of Guadalcanal. 2 transports carrying another 1,500 troops under Colonel Ichiki, escorted by 1 cruiser and 6 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 2, were 50 miles ahead of us. The plan was for half of Ichiki's vanguard troops to assault Guadalcanal, followed by the other half after the first force had been landed. Additional support troops would be provided by the Kawaguchi Brigade, whose convoy had left from Truk. On the morning of August 23rd, Destroyer Squadron 2 reported that its ships had been spotted by enemy patrol planes, and Admiral Yamamoto was thus confronted with a problem. The most appropriate solution would have been to cancel the scheduled landing operations and engage in a decisive naval action. Yamamoto, however, ordered Destroyer Squadron 2 convoy with its Ichiki troops to reverse course just for a day, and he gave no orders to the Kawaguchi convoy. He had decided to knock out the small American task force and then continue with the scheduled landing operation. Some explanations are required here to explain Yamamoto's decision, bearing in mind that hindsight judgments can never appreciate the burdens of an on-the-spot decision. Since the China War, it had been traditional for the Army to take the initiative and the Navy to follow suit. It was the Army's idea to land a battalion first, then the remainder of the regiment, and then a brigade. To demand that the Army revamp this idea would have been to break with tradition. If Yamamoto had known the strength of the enemy on Guadalcanal, he would undoubtedly have taken the bold step and ignored the tradition. But somehow the facts of the situation failed to reach him. His prime concern was for the troops holding a beachhead on the east coast of Guadalcanal. Their annihilation seemed to be only a matter of time. Something had to be done to prevent the loss of this beachhead. Yamamoto hastily formed a diversionary force of 10,150-ton Ryujo, the smallest combined fleet carrier, heavy cruiser Tone, and destroyers Tokitsukaze and Amatsukaze. This four-ship unit, led by Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, was to storm Guadalcanal and draw off the American task force reported heading toward Bougainville. The Nagumo task force, with its nucleus of two 40,000-ton carriers, was directed to turn northeastward and flank the enemy ships as they pursued Admiral Hara's decoy force. We set off at 0200 on the 24th, with 13,320-ton Tone, a weird-looking ship with all of its 8 6-inch main guns mounted on the bow deck, in the lead. Ryujo followed, flanked by Amatsukaze to starboard and our sister ship Tokitsukaze to port. We dashed toward Guadalcanal at 26 knots. The assignment was not an easy one, but it was my first really important mission of the war. My muscles twitched with excitement as I stood on the bridge. Admiral Hara, in Tone, was one of the Navy's most brilliant leaders. I had known him since my academy days when he had been an instructor, and I had full trust in him. Hara had led one carrier division of the Nagumo task force when it hit Pearl Harbor. The big concern was Ryujo. Whenever I looked at this 10-year-old carrier, I got uneasy. The best pilots were never assigned to older ships, and after losing so many crack flyers at Midway, I was positive that Ryujo's aviators were sadly inexperienced. I brooded over how this decoy would survive its first acid test in the war. At 0713, as day dawned on the South Pacific Ocean, the first enemy contact was made with a Navy float plane. It followed us for many miles but finally turned away, evidently with enough information about our strength. I groaned. We went ahead according to schedule for 4 uneasy hours without sight of any more enemy planes. The sea was extremely calm. The sun shone intermittently through thick clouds. The weather, favourable for attacking aircraft, recalled memories of Midway. What a bad day, I thought. At 1100 we were 200 miles north of Guadalcanal. 6 bombers and 15 fighters zoomed up from Ryujo and headed for the island exactly on schedule. When Ryujo turned westward toward its rendezvous with these planes, my ship swung to port, keeping 2,000 meters from the carrier. I knew that the 21 planes sent off were not the ship's full complement, and wondered why Ryujo did not fly its 9 remaining fighters as air cover. Looking at the cloud banks, I speculated on how enemy planes might spill out of them at any moment to deal a fatal blow at the vulnerable carrier, just as at Midway. Gradually I became more and more irritated. Another hour passed, and still no more fighters from Ryujo. I simply could not understand it, and mumbled angrily to myself. At 12:30, the tube from the radio room brought an excited voice. "Commander, a message from a Ryujo plane says that the Guadalcanal bombing was successful." I sighed in relief, but wondered just how effective only 6 bombers could be. I started to eat lunch, which had been brought to me on the bridge. I had just finished eating when I heard one of the lookouts call, "A plane, looks like the enemy, coming from 30 degrees to port." Through binoculars, I saw an enemy plane rambling leisurely in the distance, slipping in and out of the clouds. Signal flags went up, ship whistles blew, and guns were raised for anti-aircraft firing. As the plane approached, another emerged from the clouds. They appeared to be B-17 flying fortresses, like our old friends at Davao. I turned toward Ryujo and stared open-mouthed. All was so quiet and serene on board the carrier that I thought the skipper must be asleep. To alert Ryujo, I told my gunners to open fire, although the enemy bombers were still out of range. Tone and Tokitsukaze immediately followed suit. At last, 2 fighters zoomed up from Ryujo. The enemy planes turned tail, their reconnaissance completed. Our fighters climbed rapidly, but when they reached the enemy altitude, the B-17s had vanished into the clouds. The fighters came back and circled slowly over their carrier. My patience ended. I was worried and furious. Ryujo would be helpless against enemy planes that might appear in strength at any moment. I jotted a note and called my signal officer. "Send this message to Ryujo by semaphore at once." A signalman ran up and briskly waved his flags. From Commander Tamichi Hara, Amatsukaze CO, to Commander Hisakichi Kishi, Ryujo Exec. Fully realizing my impertinence, I'm forced to advise you of my impression. Your flight operations are far short of expectations. What is the matter? The message was probably rude and certainly audacious. I don't know of any other Japanese naval officer who sent such a message during an operation. I addressed the message to Kishi because we had been classmates at Itajima. He was not responsible for flight operations, but my intention was to awaken the skipper and flight officer who were responsible. Wondering what Kishi's reaction would be, I stared at the carrier and saw an answering signal. From Kishi to Commander Hara, deeply appreciate your admonition. We shall do better and count on your cooperation. Ryujo's action response was prompt. 7 more fighters quickly appeared on deck. Their propellers went into action almost instantly, but they were too late, for at that moment my lookouts shouted, "Many enemy planes approaching." It was about 14:02, and Ryujo was turning into the wind to launch aircraft when scores of American dive bombers attacked. I watched Ryujo anxiously. Other Japanese carriers could clear their decks of readied fighters in a matter of a few minutes. But not Ryujo. I had many other things to do. My ship was moving out to a 5,000-meter distance from Ryujo, just as were Tone and Tokitsukaze, to fight the oncoming enemy planes. Ryujo radioed the 21 planes that had struck Guadalcanal, ordering them to go to Buka, midway between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, instead of returning to the carrier. Why didn't it call back some of these 15 fighters for interception? I had no more time to speculate. The enemy SBD Dauntless bombers and Grumman fighters were pouncing on the sluggish carrier. At least 24 American bombers spilled their deadly charges around Ryujo, and fighters swooped low over the ship, machine-gunning everything in sight. Ryujo's 12 anti-aircraft guns fired sporadically without downing any of the attackers. 2 or 3 enemy bombs hit the ship near the stern, piercing the flight deck. Scarlet flames shot up from the holes. Ominous explosions followed in rapid order. Several more bombs made direct hits. Water pillars surrounded the carrier, and it was engulfed in thick black smoke. This was no deliberate smokescreen. Her fuel tanks had been hit and set afire. Was she sinking? Had she sunk? The enemy planes now turned from the carrier and headed against the other 3 of us. All guns opened fire as the planes swooped on us. My ship was making 33 knots and zigzagging frantically. Tremendous bow waves kicked up by the speeding destroyer drenched me on the bridge. Amatsukaze weathered the 30-minute attack. Some of the bombers had saved their eggs for us. None hit my ship, but there were several near misses. I breathed deeply as the enemy planes pulled away. Now I turned my eyes in the direction of Ryujo. The black smoke was beginning to dissipate, and the carrier emerged. Through binoculars, I could see that Ryujo, in her death throes, had stopped all forward motion and was sinking. A heavy starboard list exposed her red belly. Waves washed her flight deck. It was a pathetic sight. Ryujo, no longer resembling a ship, was a huge stove, full of holes which belched eerie red flames. Flagship Tone signalled, "Destroyers! Stand by Ryujo for rescue operation." My ship immediately dashed toward the sinking carrier, but we were delayed when 3 planes appeared suddenly out of the clouds, causing general alarm. As they neared, they were identified as returning Zero fighters. They circled slowly over their sinking home, as if bidding it farewell. One of them came down slowly near my ship, trying to ditch. Amatsukaze obligingly slowed down. The other 2 planes ditched alongside Takitsukaze. The 3 pilots were quickly rescued, but nothing could be done to save their planes. Precious time was lost in this rescue work. It seemed to me Ryujo would sink at any moment. But the burning carrier, despite its many gaping holes, miraculously stayed afloat. Even the eerie flames spurting from the hull subsided, possibly because of the thousands of tons of seawater flowing into her. Our hopes rose as Amatsukaze rushed to Ryujo's side. I recalled miraculous cases of effective damage control which enabled badly crippled ships to limp back for repairs. Our approach to Ryujo, however, was again suspended, this time by two B-17s which emerged from the clouds. The two destroyers and Tone had to resume speed for a zigzag run. All guns opened fire at the two bombers, which fortunately made only a half-hearted attack. Or perhaps they were simply too inexperienced to aim properly at fast-moving targets on the ocean. All their bombs were wasted. Dusk was approaching as the bombers departed and we resumed rescue operations. Thank God. Ryujo was still afloat but without power. Maybe we could tow her to Truk for repair. My wishful optimism was shattered as we drew near. The fire had gutted everything. All weapons and facilities were destroyed. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The ship was listing some 40 degrees and sinking visibly. Presently, a man started waving signal flags, which read, "We are abandoning ship. Come alongside to rescue crew." We quickly moved in along Ryujo's submerging starboard deck. If the carrier sank, as it could at any moment, a Matsukaze might be carried down with it. It was clearly no time for hesitation, and I decided to take a chance. The ocean, which had appeared calm, was actually rolling in long waves, causing the carrier's listing superstructure to pitch and brush frighteningly against the bridge of my little destroyer. Cold sweat ran down my back. Scores of strong seamen armed with long poles ran to the port side of my ship and held us off Ryujo. As long planks were set to link my ship with Ryujo, the wounded were helped and followed by the able-bodied who filed across to our ship, the officers carrying classified documents. The transfer was made very efficiently. More than 300 survivors boarded a Matsukaze. Ryujo's list suddenly increased steeply. It was sinking now. "Evacuation finished?" I shouted. An officer at the end of the plank nodded and answered, "Yes, sir. Please cast off. It's getting dangerous." A Matsukaze's powerful turbines roared into action instantly. The destroyer responded quickly and moved desperately away. We had gone scarcely 500 meters when Ryujo disappeared among the waves. The tremendous whirlpool caused by its sinking made a Matsukaze bob like a cork. It was a close shave indeed. I was still breathing hard when a low voice behind me said, "Commander Hara, I do not know how to thank you." I turned around and saw Captain Tadao Kato of Ryujo, the last man in the evacuation line. This was the man I had cursed so many times only a few hours ago. Kato, haggard and pathetic, bowed to me and croaked, "Please accept my humble thanks on behalf of my men." Suddenly I felt sorry for this general line officer, not a specialist, and my anger switched abruptly to Admiral Yamamoto, who had chosen such a man for a decoy mission. "You need not thank me, Captain Kato," I replied curtly. "You look ill. Are you hurt?" "No, Hara, not a bit. But so many of my men were lost, and the ship—" Hands to face, he sobbed, no longer able to control himself. I feared he might collapse and called, "Orderly, quick! Take Captain Kato to my cabin." "Oh no, Hera," Kato protested. "Let me stay with my men, any place that won't bother your operation." I let him do as he pleased, since every inch of my ship was jammed with the rescued crew of Ryujo. I pitied the old captain as he trudged toward the ladder. "Captain Kato," I called. "Just a moment. May I ask if my good friend Kishi, your exec, is safe?" Kato turned back speechless, his haggard face wrinkled with the pain of sorrow. I understood and nodded. Kato lowered his head and went below. I was stunned. My friend Kishi was dead. Kishi had a brilliant record as an aviation specialist. Had he been given a free hand by this line skipper from the beginning, things might have turned out better. I shook my head. There was still important work to be done. Morning had to wait until duties were completed. My ship joined Tokitsukaze and flagship Tone, and I was elated to find them unscathed like mine. They were still busy picking up some Ryujo crewmen who had jumped overboard. Meanwhile, 14 Ryujo planes returned from the strike on Guadalcanal and circled overhead. 7, including the only radio-equipped one of the flight, were lost. The remainder, accordingly, did not know they had been ordered to land at Buka. They had to ditch, and our 3 ships picked up the crews, but all the planes sank. The sun was setting as Tone, Tokitsukaze and Amatsukaze started eastward under orders from Nagumo to join his main task force. This day of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, August 24, 1942, had been a long one for me, and it was not yet over. After cruising some 50 miles toward our scheduled rendezvous, we observed a group of Japanese warships moving slowly to the south with their searchlights blazing. The night was black as pitch, the bombs and guns had been silent for hours, and I was beginning to feel the accumulated fatigue of a day-long battle following a sleepless night when these ships were sighted. I was thinking it would be good now to have a short nap when my signal officer reported that flagship Shokaku was blinking a signal to Amatsukaze. Admiral Nagumo directs Commander Hara to rescue 2 Zuikaku pilots adrift. Proceed at once to position KIN-21. I replied immediately, from Commander to Admiral Nagumo. Amatsukaze will proceed at once to KIN-21 and rescue Zuikaku's pilots. Turning to the charts, I checked the indicated grid position and whistled. KIN-21 was 98 miles almost due south of our present position, and it was within 60 miles of the enemy task force position as reported at the time of Ryujo's sinking. But orders were orders, and this was no time for hesitation. My drowsiness vanished, and I summoned my staff for consultation. We could not afford to be off course by the slightest bit in this mission. I had no idea how the position of the pilots had been determined, but knew that our slim chance of rescuing them would be greatly reduced if there was any error in navigation. Admiral Nagumo had been so good to me that, knowing he had chosen me especially for this mission, I was determined to live up to his expectations. We were approaching what might well be the jaws of the lion, but my men were willing and eager, and I was with them. 4 hours of running at 24 knots put us in the approximate area. I slowed Amatsukaze to 6 knots. With no stars visible, a sextant was of no use, so we had to rely on dead reckoning. When Ensign Hideo Shoji reported that we were in the designated grid position, I called all spare crewmen to stand lookout, announcing that whoever discovered the first clue leading to rescue of Zuikaku's pilots would be rewarded. The men ran enthusiastically to positions of vantage around the ship. Since there were Japanese pilots down in this vicinity, I had to assume that enemy pilots might also have ditched here, and that they were also being looked for. Accordingly, I could not allow the use of searchlights which might draw attention to our position. Our destroyer, snailing along at 6 knots, was as vulnerable to submarine attack as an old transport. After half an hour of fruitless searching, I became concerned about our fuel supply. In addition to all the other factors that had to be considered, Amatsukaze had used much fuel in its decoy mission with Ryujo, and we still needed enough to reach Rabaul 500 miles away. With this in mind, I ordered small running lights placed on the sideboards. Within minutes, a sailor in the bow sang out, "Floating object to starboard, looks like a bottle." I leaned from the bridge railing, saw the pop bottle reflecting the green running light, and shouted, "Good! They must be nearby!" Cheered by this turn, I ordered a weak signal light from the bridge to blink the name of the pilot's ship. "Zuikaku! Zuikaku!" Another half-hour passed, and hope was waning when out of the darkness I saw a flick of a light off the port bow. It flickered again, some 1,000 meters distant, and went out, but this time I was sure. Turning in that direction, a boat was lowered from Amatsukaze when we had approached to within 100 meters and saw 2 men clinging to a raft. Ensign Hideo Shoji commanded the rescue boat. A blue-shaded light was used to assist the operation, and Shoji paused halfway to the raft to report back that the men looked like Americans. I grabbed binoculars for a close scrutiny. In the blue light they did look like Americans, but I ordered, Rescue the men, whoever they are. My knees were shaking. If these men were Americans, it meant that our search must continue. But I was resolved to carry out my mission if it meant searching until dawn. As our boat reached the raft, a flashlight blinked that these were the Japanese we sought, and I breathed a sigh of great relief. With the men safely on board, we headed north at 24 knots, and I relaxed in a chair for the first time in many hours. Our rescue mission of the day was a complete success. Our decoy mission, on the other hand, had met a dismal end, and yet it had not been a failure. The sacrifice of Ryujo had deflected the enemy from the main Japanese force and permitted Admiral Nagumo to concentrate his full air strength against Enterprise. Still, the sinking of Ryujo as against the damaging of Enterprise was no advantage for Japan, since the latter carrier survived and was restored to service within 2 months. Furthermore, the U.S. Navy bombed the Ichiki convoy and damaged cruiser Jintsu, the escort flagship. 6 destroyers of the squadron closed Guadalcanal and bombarded it furiously during the night, but B-17s hit back the following morning and raked the ships for several hours. The convoy escaped to Bougainville, but not before destroyer Mutsuki had been sunk and transport Kinryu Maru sunk. Learning of the stiff opposition to be expected, the Kawaguchi convoy turned around and went back to Truk. Thus, the whole of this second encounter in the Solomons ended in a Japanese defeat, tactically and strategically, and Yamamoto's decision was proved wrong. 2 days after the operation, I heard an Imperial Headquarters communiqué claiming that in the Battle of August 23-25, heavy damage had been inflicted on a large American carrier, medium damage to a medium American carrier and a Pennsylvania-class battleship. The communiqué admitted to the loss of only 1 Japanese destroyer sunk and heavy damage to a small carrier. An American announcement said Saratoga's planes had bombed a Japanese carrier and damaged a cruiser and a destroyer. It admitted considerable damage to Enterprise, but went on to say that the Saratoga and Marine planes had also scored hits on a battleship and 2 cruisers.